Rex Uerman is currently charged with murdering the Gilgo 4. However, he has yet to be linked to any of the earlier victims. This has led to speculation that another killer may have been involved. In this video, I will break down why the two-killer theory is far less likely. If Uerman killed the Gilgo 4, then I believe that he is also responsible for the earlier victims. In December 2010, the remains of 4 women were found off Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. These women were nicknamed the Gilgo 4 due to their location and the fact that they were found so close together. The following spring, the police broadened their search and discovered 6 more victims spaced out along Ocean Parkway. This brought the total victim count to 10. The Gilgo 4 went missing between 2007 and 2010. The other 6 victims disappeared between 1996 and 2003. Most of the earlier victims were dismembered and dumped in multiple places across Long Island. The Gilgo 4, on the other hand, were not dismembered. Instead, they were all dumped whole in the same general area. As you can see, there are some differences between the Gilgo 4 and the earlier victims. The change in MO has led to theories that 2 or more killers were using Ocean Parkway as a dumping ground. However, when you look at the details, it becomes clear that the two-killer theory requires not just one coincidence. It requires multiple coincidences all rolled into one. The first and most obvious coincidence is the location. All of the victims were dumped along the same stretch of highway, just 8 miles apart. This is not a populated metropolitan area. It is a secluded barrier island with 3 access points. At the start of the investigation, the FBI concluded that 1 killer was involved. This is because there is no precedent of 2 serial killers using the exact same dumping ground. The Texas killing fields near Houston are often mentioned whenever this topic is brought up. However, the Texas killing fields is a general term that refers to multiple victims that were spread out across a very large geographical area. It is not the same thing. Leakin Park in Baltimore is also frequently brought up. Again, this is different. Leakin Park is situated in a city that has a high rate of violent crime. The victims were all found across a 70-year span. If you look at the details, you'll find that there are differences in the victim profiles, circumstances, and the causes of death. Furthermore, different killers and suspects exist in each case. When it comes to Gilgo Beach, people tend to focus on the distance between the victims. However, what is more telling is the time that it takes to drive between each site. If you drive southbound from where Valerie Mack was found, you'll reach the Gilgo 4 site in less than 2 minutes. If you keep going, you'll pass by Karen Vergata's site roughly 2 minutes later. To put all of this in perspective, the killer drove by Jessica Taylor's site less than 60 seconds before he pulled over to dump the Gilgo 4. If multiple killers were using the same dumping ground, you would expect variations in the victim profiles. However, in this case, all of the victims were petite sex workers. If 2 killers were involved, then it would mean that they both targeted petite sex workers and chose the exact same location as a dumping ground. The combination of these 2 factors make it even less likely that 2 killers were involved. 2 of the Gilgo 4 victims were picked up in Manhattan. It is believed that 3 of the earlier victims were also working there. This would mean that 2 killers hunted for petite sex workers in Manhattan and chose Gilgo as a dumping ground. Again, this makes the two-killer theory far less likely. The Gilgo 4 victims were bound with either belts or tape. A source told Pix11 News that 2 of the Manorville victims had been bound and tied up in a very cruel way. Serial killers are often sloppy creatures who struggle to control their urges. Kendall Francois, Gary Ridgway, Arthur Shawcross, Joel Rifkin, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and Larry Bright all killed weeks or months apart. Sometimes it was just a matter of days. In this case, both of the supposed killers were able to go 2 to 3 years without killing. This indicates that both offenders had considerable time constraints. such as a family. Another telling detail is the lack of overlap between the earlier victims and the Gilgo Four. If two killers were involved, you'd expect to see some kind of overlap between the dismembered victims and the non-dismembered victims. For example, the timeline might look like this. Instead, the dismemberment stopped in 2003, just 4 years before the first Gilgo 4 victim went missing. Now, we must entertain the idea that two serial killers were targeting petite sex workers. Both hunted for victims in Manhattan, both used Gilgo Beach as a dumping ground, both show signs that they had considerable time constraints, and both used bindings. Then, to top it all off, the first killer supposedly stopped in 2003, while Rex Heuermann allegedly started in 2007. If you look at the locations where the victims were found, and compare it against the timeline, you can see that from 1997 onward, the first killer began spacing the remains out in a westbound pattern. This was most likely done to avoid a situation where all of the victims were found at once. This means that Rex Heuermann didn't just start 4 years after the first killer. He also picked up exactly where the other one left off. However, due to the location, he couldn't really continue to space them apart. If you look at the site where the Gilgo 4 were found, you will see that the median strip on Ocean Parkway becomes much more narrow. This meant that he couldn't continue westbound without exposing himself to oncoming traffic. He had two choices, either stick to the current area or find a new spot. By this stage, it is also likely that complacency was beginning to creep in, as he had been operating for more than a decade without being detected. One of the unidentified victims was a 5'6" Asian male who was found just east of the Gilgo 4. The police believed that the victim was trans, as he was found wearing women's clothing. Rex Heuermann's bail application form shows that he searched for the following on a burner phone. Following Heuermann's arrest, many people were still convinced that the earlier victims were killed by a convicted murderer named John Bittrolff. This was due to the fact that he lived so close to where the two Manorville victims were found. In July of 2023, Pix11 News reported that the task force was looking at Bittrolff very closely, but that they weren't ruling out Heuermann. 5 months later, Suffolk County DA Raymond Tierney publicly ruled out Bittrolff, stating he has nothing to do with Lisk. Notably, Tierney did not rule out Heuermann. This begs the following questions. What evidence did the task force uncover in those 5 months? Was Bittrolff ruled out by DNA? If so, what is the state of that DNA? Lastly, why didn't he rule out Heuermann? So far, Heuermann has only been charged with the Gilgo 4 murders. However, this does not mean that he won't be linked to the other victims at a later date. The authorities are focusing on the most recent murders because there is enough evidence to secure a conviction. This is relatively common in serial killer cases. Ted Bundy was only found guilty of 3 murders, even though he later confessed to many more. Richard Cottingham was initially found guilty of murdering 2 women. We now know that he is responsible for nearly 20 murders. Joel Rifkin was convicted of 9 murders, even though he was responsible for at least 17. Coincidentally, Rifkin was another Long Island serial killer who changed his MO. In some cases, he dismembered his victims. In other cases, he didn't. Most serial killers tend to start between the ages of 25 and 35. There are 2 things happening here. 1, their confidence levels are rising. 2, their violent fantasies are taking on a coherent shape. Ted Bundy was 27 when he killed his first known victim. Joel Rifkin was 30. BTK was 28. Dahmer was 27 when his main series began. John Wayne Gacy was 34. Gary Ridgway was 33. There are outliers, but they are usually pretty close to this range. When the first Gilgo 4 victim went missing in July of 2007, Heuermann was 43 or 44. This puts him well outside the range. The first Gilgo Beach victim, Karen Vergata, disappeared during the spring of 1996. At the time, Rex Heuermann would have been 32.